Hi, I'm Tom Kaplan, a PhD student at Queen Mary University of London, and I'll be presenting on modelling entrainment as continuous Bayesian inference using learned rhythmic prototypes. To start by putting this work into context, symbolic grammar-like structures of auditory rhythm have been widely used as a cognitive model of schematic temporal expectations. For example, probabilistic grammars have been used to model metrical expectations in music and how these expectations emerge through stylistic enculturation. Jacobi and McDermott have demonstrated that when participants synchronize their tapping to non-uniform, three-interval auditory rhythms, they're biased by their prior expectations, such that iterated reproductions converge on rhythms with integer-interval ratios resembling schematic patterns. So in this work, we investigate the cognitive mechanisms by which schematic expectations are used in entrainment to non-uniform auditory rhythms, which includes rhythms used in iterated reproduction paradigms, but also musical rhythms with expressive timing. So we frame our work using two powerful ideas in literature. The first being that Bayesian inference can predict rhythm perception, such as rhythm categorisation, when using priors that draw upon the frequency counts of rhythmic patterns in symbolic music corpora. And second is that music cultural environments appear to shape the perceptual prototypes used in synchronization to periodic rhythms, as perceptual priors measured in iterated reproduction paradigms can be linked to culture-specific musical features. So, inspired by these ideas, we're presenting a model comprised of two distinct processes. The first, stylistic enculturation, so the acquisition of schematic rhythmic prototypes through passive exposure to rhythms in a given musical culture. And second, expectancy-based entrainment, where phase is inferred in continuous time using these symbolic prototypes. These are then related through an inferential process which I'll describe later on. So starting with how we simulate stylistic enculturation, we use a probabilistic model of auditory expectation, which has been used widely in the literature to characterize enculturation through statistical learning. So given a music corpus, the model derives predictive distributions from the frequency of interval ratio patterns, and this allows it to predict a symbolic rhythmic event given some preceding context. And in this work, we aren't using any context dependence and simply use these distributions to derive a set of symbolic rhythmic prototypes. So in order to model entrainment to a sequence of rhythmic events in continuous time, we use a model of expectancy-based entrainment. So entrainment here is modeled as continuous Bayesian inference of phase, given a reference expectation template such as the one shown on the right. And this expectation template consists of a series of Gaussian distributions for expected rhythmic events, each characterized by a specified expectation strength and an expectation precision. And crucially, this allows us to flexibly transform symbolic rhythmic prototypes into continuous time expectation templates for use in phase inference. And I strongly encourage you to check out Jonathan Cannon's poster titled Bayes Optimal Rhythm Perception, which describes this model in much greater detail. So next, we're going to focus on the selection of prototypes and the interaction between these two different processes. And what we've done is we've extended the entrainment model to incorporate a mechanism of prototype inference. And this begins with the set of rhythmic prototypes that we've acquired through enculturation, each of them converted into expectation templates. The prior probability of each prototype is initialized according to our enculturation model, and then the probability of each prototype drifts over time during phase inference. So on auditory events, depicted here with the dashed lines, the likelihoods jump around, reflecting the contribution of a given prototype to phase inference. And over time, the effect is that the model can infer the most plausible prototype in interpreting a non-uniform rhythm. So to summarize the behavior that's simulated by this model, first through simulated enculturation, we acquire a discrete set of rhythmic prototypes, and these are what are used in interpreting any given non-uniform rhythm. Second, phase inference in expectancy-based entrainment is biased towards these prototypes, which essentially serve as prior expectations for rhythmic patterns. And third, the frequency by which these prototypes occur during enculturation can be used to alter the strength of this bias. So, for example, Prevalent prototypes can be given a higher prior probability, increasing the breadth of their attractor effect, alongside greater expectation strength and precision in phase inference, increasing their attractor strength. In order to illustrate this behavior, we're going to present some preliminary simulations, and we focus on the iterated reproduction paradigm using the method of Jacobi and McDermott. And in this, we have 3 interval rhythms characterized by the blue dot on the right-hand ternary plot. And these are repeated in a given iteration multiple times, and participants are simply asked to synchronize tapping to these. So for our model, in place of taps, we use the posterior for phase. And similarly to participants, the model spends a bit of time at the beginning of each trial inferring a prototype, just listening to the stimulus before tracking phase in the context of its selected prototype. And what happens is at the end of a iteration, the responses, so in this case, our phase estimates are averaged to produce a new 3-interval rhythm, as shown by the green dot on the right-hand plot. And what happens is over time, successive iterations, the prior expectations in the listener exert a bias, causing these 3-interval rhythms to converge on priors. So we simulate this for 2 distinct models. We're differing enculturation, and the idea of this is to illustrate the result of differing music cultural environments. So we train a German model using the Essen folk song collection and a Turkish model trained on Makam music. So for each model, here we visualize how the 3-interval rhythms evolve over successive iterations with respect to simple integer ratios, which are marked by the little red crosses. And just as a reminder, each dot reflects a single trial and a single 3-interval rhythm. And similarly to the production bias observed behaviorally, it's clear that phase inference is biased over successive iterations towards rhythmic prototypes. Now, when you look at the density estimate for 3-interval rhythms in the final iteration and compare this to a uniform distribution, we see prominent convergence towards rhythms with simple integer ratios, such as 1-1-1, isochrony, 1-2-1, etc. And these are classically considered widespread or even universal rhythmic patterns across musical cultures. So what's interesting is that when we visualize the difference between these models using the relative entropy, we see divergence. And a good example of this is in the Turkish model, where we see a higher density at the mildly complex interval ratio 2-2-3, which is a common rhythmic pattern in Balkan music. Additionally, in order to understand where this emerges from in our model, we can visualize how the 3-interval rhythms are categorized at the very beginning of each trial, so after the first 4 events. And what we do in these plots is we assign a unique color to each prototype, such that each cluster here essentially corresponds to a distinct prototype. And what we can see on the Turkish model is increased assignment at the mildly complex interval ratio 2-2-3, and we can relate this to different underlying priors for culturally relevant prototypes. And interestingly, we observe these prominent convex regions around the simple interval ratios, again 1-1-1, 1-2-1, etc. And these resemble the patterns of rhythm categorization observed by Dazan and Herning in their series of rhythm categorization tasks. So in order to take this model beyond these preliminary and highly qualitative observations, we intend to directly compare the measured priors in our simulated iterated reproduction to those in behavioral data. And separately, we expect the model should demonstrate similar effects of metric priming to those explored in existing rhythm categorization tasks, and it should also remain sensitive to the reported influence of enculturation in these kind of tasks. Finally, the thing I'm most interested in is applying the model to exploring the perception of musical rhythms with expressive timing, so cases where metrical expectations might actually differ in their temporal precision. And some examples of where this might be applied are to things like pocket and participatory discrepancy, alongside extended beats, which have very durational patterns. That's all for today, so thank you very much for listening, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you have.